glory. Well, we welcome you to Mount Sinai Missionary Baptist Church for the Selma to Montgomery protesting in the 1965 Voting Act, presented by our very own beloved Dr. Annie McCullough Chavis. Give her a round of applause as she comes.
I'm going to say good afternoon again, and thank you for everyone that has come out in this rainy weather. I want to start my presentation by saying that the Montgomery to Selma to Montgomery marches is part of what we call 3 marches. And we're going to look at some of the historical figures and some of the information that led to the 1965 Voting Rights Act. The first slide that you will see is a picture of the marchers as they marched through the bridge, and we call this bridge what bridge? The Edmund Pettus Bridge, which they are trying to rename the John Lewis King Lewis Bridge. I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about the Selma marches. And I want to say that the Selma to the Montgomery marches were not just one march, but 3 marches. And actually there were 5 because there were 2 that were done in January and February by Martin Luther King. But we're looking at the 3 in March that led to the Voting Rights Act. And so there were 2 groups that were involved in that march. The first group was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and that was led by the late Congressman John Lewis. The second one was the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and that was led and founded by Dr. Martin Luther King. Both of those groups advocated for voting rights for blacks, and the reason that they advocated for voting rights for blacks is because after freedom in 1865, when enslaved blacks were given their freedom, there were laws that were enacted that took away those freedoms. So that's why we're given a historical point of view of that. And after freedom, there were 5 states, all southern states, that had a majority black representation. Those states were Alabama, Florida, Louisiana, and Mississippi, and South Carolina. So after 1865, we had what we call the beginning of Reconstruction, in which blacks, emancipated black men, could vote. And the first group that could vote were black men, and we had our first group of congressmen. One of those was Howard Revers. If you look on Murchison Road, you'll see a sign, because Howard Revers, even though he represented Mississippi, he was born in Fayetteville, North Carolina. So we have a historical sign for him on Murchison Road right by the Martin Luther King Park. And if you look at the next slide, we're going to give you a brief historical presentation in terms of how we entwine the voting rights law with Reconstruction. Reconstruction was from 1865 in some sources to 1876. That's when black men enjoyed voting, and they were represented in Congress. And so that's important for us to look at in terms of that. But after Reconstruction, we had the black codes because too many blacks were being represented. So the black codes were codes that were enacted by the Democrats to disenfranchise blacks and to control all of their behavior. We had such activities as the convict law in which you could lease blacks out. You had the vagrancy law. If you did not have a job and you were caught walking or anything, you were confined to jail. And then you had the sharecropping. So these were all parts of activities and codes that would keep blacks enslaved even after slavery. And so in 1876, that was the end of Reconstruction. And so it was replaced, that was the legal system. Not only the black codes, but also Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws were what? They were laws that segregation and unequal facilities and treatments, colored only restroom. Next slide would show an example of how these laws made it very separate and unequal for blacks. And so when you look at Jim Crow again, some sources say 1876 to 1964. But if you remember, in 1964, the Civil Rights Law was passed. So you still had the Jim Crow laws. Again, these were laws that we had colored-only bathrooms, colored-only schools, so very separate and unequal laws. And this is an example of one of the pictures showing, you see the bus in the back, and you see the sign saying colored only. And so the source that I looked at said 1876 to 1964. But I graduated from high school in 1965 from an all-black high school, so it went longer than that in some areas of the South. And now I want to give you a timeline because I believe in going back and giving you historical information so that you can understand how we came about having the Selma to the Montgomery marches and also the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And so if we look at the timeline for the three marches, remember I said there were 3 marches in March, but there are also 2 that Dr. Martin Luther King led in January and February, and we'll come back to that later. On the 5th of March, Dr. Martin Luther King met with President Lyndon Johnson to advocate for the Voting Rights Act. It was not enacted at that time. So on March the 7th is what we call Bloody Sunday. That was the first march. And on that date, we'll come back to that a little later and talk about it a little more. And then the second march was on March the 9th. And the third march was on March the 25th, which started on March the 21st. And the marchers marched 12 miles per day and lived and stayed in fields until the 25th of March. And so you just think from March the 21st to Thursday, March the 25th. And that's the timeline. But we'll go back and talk about what happened on those 3 marches, March the 6th, March the 9th, and March the 25th. Okay, so let's first look at Bloody Sunday, March the 7th, 1965. That's when we had the march in terms of John Lewis led that march. Martin Luther King was not there at that march. But as I said earlier, in January and February of 1965, King led 2 marches in Dallas County Courthouse in Alabama, Montgomery. And so the next one, Bloody Sunday. What happened on Bloody Sunday that stands out? The marchers, which I said earlier, were led by Jose Williams and John Lewis. Martin Luther King was absent that Sunday, but we know that that was the march that really culminated into a lot of protestation and a lot of demonstration, because with that march, The marchers were beaten by state troopers and local policemen, and they called it Bloody Sunday because almost 50 members of, were hospitalized. And you see a picture of John Lewis. Remember, in his book, John Lewis talked about how he was beaten in the head and what happened to him. So that happened on March the 6th, 1965, Bloody Sunday. And that march on March the 6th was significant because it was televised nationally and internationally. So it brought a lot of attention to what was happening in the South in terms of the violations, the discrimination, and the racial injustices that were given to black people, primarily by white people. And so, again, this is the slide showing where 600 marchers on that Sunday, and 50 of them had to be hospitalized. And the next 3 slides will just show you just how violent the state troopers and the local policemen were, and how so many people were beaten and just taken to the hospital. But they were victorious in that they stood their ground because the reasons why they were beaten so is because when they got ready to cross the bridge, and they crossed the bridge, the state troopers and the local police told them not to come any further, to go back. And when they refused, that's when they started beating them, having tear gas, and that's why it's called Bloody Sunday. The second march was not actually a march that they crossed the bridge. This march was on March the 9th by Martin Luther King. And he led a group of marchers to the bridge, and the state troopers and the local policemen were standing there ready for them with tear gas and bullet clubs and everything else that would do harm to them. So they turned around. So this was sort of like a symbolic march, but it also showed the nation just how vicious and how much there was so much discrimination and violence in terms of blacks trying to get the right to vote, which was actually given to us by which amendment? The 15th Amendment, the right for black men to vote. We know that the 19th Amendment was for women to vote. And so after this march, Martin Luther King met with President Lyndon Johnson. President Johnson also talked with Governor George Wallace about the violence. And finally, for the third march, federal troops were called in by President Lyndon Johnson to protect the marchers. And Martin Luther King also made a plea to clergymen and other people, black and white, to have a nonviolent march. So let's talk about the third march, which was started on March the 21st, and the marchers marched 12 miles, and then they stayed in fields. They marched 12 more miles. And so the march from Selma to Montgomery was 54 miles. So on that Thursday, that's the historic day, because that's when they were able to finish the 3 marches. March the 25th, started on March the 21st, but on March the 25th. And so that culminated into a 3-month campaign. Remember, I said that Martin Luther King had 2 marches in January and February. And so the 3 marches in March, 3 months. And so they were victorious. And so the next slide you will see how many more persons of all races came out for the final march, which led them to the courthouse. And this was the final march. And the second slide will also show you the same thing. Look at the difference in the number of people. And just think that 12 miles one day, 12 miles the next day, until they reached the Dallas County Montgomery courthouse. And that's where also Martin Luther King made a plea too. And you see the Capitol, the courthouse Capitol in the background. And so this was the final march in which they were victorious. But they were only victorious because President Johnson federalized the National Guard to guide them in there. Remember, George Wallace, the state troopers, and the local police were brutalizing the marchers. But that's the victorious part. And so these marches in Alabama for the right for blacks to vote led to the Voting Rights Law of 1965. I want to read you the full name of that law. And that law is Voting Rights Act, an act to enforce the 15th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States and in purposes, be it enacted by Senate and House of United States Representatives, be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the U.S. of America in Congress, amended act shall be called the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So that's the long name of that act. Let's talk a little bit about why the Voting Rights Act is so important and what were the outcome of that act. So the outcome of the Voting Rights Act was it has several parts to it, and there were many provisions in there. But the main provision that was in there was jurisdiction in the South that were protected because if at least 50% of the non-black voters had not registered to vote and vote. And they had jurisdiction, and they had to get permission from the U.S. government, particularly the Attorney General, in order to change anything. And so what did it do? What were the, and there is a lot more to this, but I'm just giving you some of this. First of all, it banned the literacy test, which was a test we know that blacks had to know how to read, and they still failed them. That's why they could not vote. Secondly, it provided for federal oversight of voters' registration. As I said earlier, when less than 50% of the non-white population had not registered to vote, and that was all over the South where that was happening. Then it prohibited poll taxes. Everyone had to pay poll taxes, and so if you did not pay them, or even if they did pay them, blacks were still were prevented from voting. And lastly, what we're seeing reoccurring today, gerrymandering, where there are some districts, and they were all in the South, particularly in the states that we saw that had the majority of black representation after Reconstruction. So that gerrymandering were again, so that they could not vote because they diluted the votes of the blacks. And so that 1965 Voting Rights Law was such a law that it made for changes in blacks moving from disenfranchisement to enfranchisement. And it's called, if you think about the 1964 Civil Rights Law, and then you think about the 1965 Voting Rights Law, the Voting Rights Law was much more prominent in terms of how it affected us because we had the right to vote again. And so it was called the single most effective piece of civil rights legislation that ever was passed by Congress, ever passed by Congress. And you think about in 1965, prior to the Voting Rights Law and after the Voting Rights Law, we had 6 black men in the House and no black members of Congress. And all of those members in the House were from the Midwest. They were from California, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Michigan, none from the South. And when we looked at Congress in 1971, when the Black Caucus was organized, 13 members of the House and 1 black senator. Anybody know who that black senator was in 1971? Edward Brooks, first black senator that we had. And if we move along and look at the Voting Rights Law, look at it for the 109th Congress, we had 42 black members of the House and 1 black member of the Senate. 2005 to 2007, who was that black senator? Our former president, Barack Obama. He was the only black senator in the 109th Congress. As we move down, looking at the effects of the Voting Rights Law for the 118th Congress, we had a historic 58 members. So that tells us of the significance of that Voting Rights Act in 1965. Just think from 1965 to 2007 and from there on. And in 2014 to 2016, there were 43 black members in terms of that. So you see how it has inched up and everything. I should have put 2014 and 2016 first. In 2023, which is a current Congress, there are 55 members that are black. And we have 1 black senator, Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina. So that just shows you the power, again, of the Voting Rights Act and of how those Selma to Montgomery marches culminated into from disenfranchisement to enfranchisement. And I wanted us to do this today to come to a conclusion of where are we today. If you look at the map, this map is of 2013, but it shows you something of what happened in 2013. You see the green spots, those were the Voting Rights Act of 1965 because of the dilution of black votes. And so you see that in North Carolina, it was part of North Carolina that was governed by the 1965 Voting Rights Law. But you see most of the other southern states, you find more. And you even see Alaska and Hawaii. That was because the Voting Rights Law has been amended several times. And so in 1975, it included other than blacks, Asian, Alaskan, Native American. So that was why you see Alaska up there, because those votes were also diluted by the disenfranchised in terms of voting. So the Voting Rights Act, very important act. And I want to kind of move to 2013. That's when we had the Supreme Court come out with the Shelby versus Holden. And Shelby County in Alabama, Eric Holden, who was the Attorney General in 2013. And this decision by the Supreme Court diluted the Voting Rights Act tremendously. So where we are today in terms of that, that's why you're hearing about redistricting, the maps, gerrymandering, as we will call it. You're seeing a lot of that. ID, voter registration, is because of that change in the 2013 of the Voting Rights Law that went all the way to the Supreme Court. And it was a split, it wasn't a split decision, but it was a 5-4 decision. And so that's why you're hearing about the calling for the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act today. If you look at the slides again, I want you to see this is kind of like the end of what we're doing in terms of the presentation. These are the slides showing, again, if you look to the right, you'll see John Lewis, and in the middle, you'll see Dr. Martin Luther King. This is showing you how the marches from Selma to Montgomery changed in terms of how the voting rights law was enacted because of that. And this is another slide, again, showing the same thing. Okay, and I want to show this one because this is the New York Times is one of the most read paper. So you see again, the New York Times had a picture of the marches from Bloody Sunday and the outcry that it had not only in the United States, but nationally. The outcry was so great and the pictures were so poignant in terms of how they saw the United States and particularly the South. And so after those pictures and the time, New York Times and other newspapers, there was such an outcry that when Martin Luther King approached President Lyndon Johnson and others, the Voting Rights Act was signed in August of 1965. And so we can see from looking at the marches from Selma to Montgomery and how all of the marches and the demonstration that occurred led to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I keep saying 1865. That's on my mind. But 1965. So one of the things that I want us to look at in terms of where are we now? Next slide, please. So these are some questions that we are posing. One is, how has the 2013 Voting Rights Act changed voting? And so I've explained that to you in terms of there were jurisdictions that, because of the discriminatory practices before, that they had to have the approval of the federal government before any changes could be made. And so that was taken out of that, and that was under Section 4 and 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And so that's why the second question, why is the John Lewis Voting Act still not a reality? Has anyone thought in terms of that? Why is it not a reality? This is 2023, and the partly disenfranchised of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 happened with the Supreme Court in 2013. And we're still not where we need to be. The next question I asked, where are we today in terms of voting? And the last one, what must we do in 2023 in terms of voting and disenfranchisement? So these are some questions that I'm posing to the audience and comments by the audience. And before I start that, are there any questions? No questions? Okay. Okay. Comments? I'm gonna say like the pastor. I'm looking at the plant. I'm looking at the plants. Uh-huh. In terms of, let me just talk a little bit about the Voting Rights Act of, in terms of what happened in 2013. Uh, and, and in 2013, uh, the Supreme Court, as I told you, the case started with Shelby versus Holden. Shelby County in Alabama. Alabama was one of those states, that's why we had the marches. Alabama was still one of those states that were diluting the black votes. And because they were diluting the black votes, it meant that in order to have any changes, that they had to show it to the federal government, and the federal government would then decide. And that was one of the things that changed. You remember in North Carolina, even in North Carolina, we have had some acts in terms of the 1965 Voting Rights Law that were changed. And we had, in some of those cases, had to go to court, and some of them even went to the Supreme Court. So it was not only in Alabama, but it was in most southern states that we were trying to disenfranchise the votes of blacks. And again, remember, the 15th Amendment gave black men the right to vote, and of course the 19th gave women the right to vote. But with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, all people got the right to vote. And if you were in those jurisdiction or state in which 50% of the non-voters were not registered, then you came under the auspice of the federal government. So those jurisdictions. So that was one of the changes that happened with the Supreme Court case in 2013. And now you see evidence that is changing the right to votes of many people. And you remember we talked about the black codes and the Jim Crowism, the vagrancy law, the poll taxes, the gerrymandering, the convict lease system. All of this happened before the Voting Rights Act, and after the act, it could not happen. And so you had the federal oversee of the federal government. But with 2013 change in that 1965 Voting Rights Act, a lot of that was taken out. And so here we are today. It seems like some of the same things that Martin Luther King, John Lewis, Jose Williams, Reverend Abernathy, and all the marchers fought for, some of those changes seem to be coming back in a different way, that we're being disenfranchised. So that was one of the reasons I wanted the Black History Ministry to revisit this, and so that we could look at, this is a voting year. And as a voting year, we need to be well informed in terms of where we are now. And I hope from this presentation, and I can't say comments, but from this presentation, that it's something for us to think about in terms of the values of the marches from Selma to Montgomery, the protests by the marchers, the leadership of Dr. Martin Luther King, the late Congressman John Lewis, and others, and where we are today. Okay. Okay. And that is the end of my presentation. Any questions again? Thank you very much. Yes. Yes, please.
A lot of what happened back in years 1965 that is occurring now is just a kind of purpose by design to still go after the southern states that produce votes that will not be in the will of certain people, not in the will of all people, but in the will of certain people. When we talk about everybody having an ID to vote, and sometimes that might seem like it's really easy because everybody should have an ID. But if you lose your ID and you don't have all the documents that you need to get that ID, then it becomes a problem because not everybody can get their hands on, let's say, a birth certificate. We move here and there, different things happen, and that is something that may be known. In my job, the work that I do, we do ask people if they want to register to vote. Many people have different reasons. They already voted, they're not registered to vote, or maybe they have been incarcerated, that they don't know those rules, whether they can vote. But the other thing is that sometimes people, they still don't see the importance of their vote. One vote does count, and they cannot see it. If you ride the city buses in Fayetteville, the city does get money to help those buses to run. And if we vote and money is taken from those budgets, then it does still disenfranchise us. And I think that we need to be as intentional as we can be and really speak in truth the power on what it really is. PBS has lots of documentations on voting, busing, all different things I've been watching late that tell a story. But if we don't know the history of the story and see where it parallels to today, then we lose ourselves and we lose generations, not just one, generations that don't understand what the cost of not voting is. And not voting does have consequences.
Thank you. I think that was a good comment in that we do need, that's why history is so important. That's why knowing our history, as our pastor constantly tells us, Black history is every day. The voting right, that's part of history. That's part of history that we need to know. Okay.
Good evening, Dr. Chavis.
Good evening.
My question to you is, as a Black woman and looking at the numbers of our last voting, or mass voting, which was the presidential election, what are your recommendations for the low numbers of Black women who went out to the polls to vote?
I would recommend, and I'm not an expert, but I would recommend that we must all help each other to vote. So one of the things that I've noticed is that when there are events in our neighborhood, like your Motor Festival, that's a wonderful opportunity to register people to vote and encourage them to vote. And to talk about, in our churches and other organizations, our fraternities, sororities, in all our organizations, our alumni association, it's important that we now, please excuse me, Thank you. Didn't see that. It's important that we encourage each other and talk about the importance of voting. And not only talk about it, we can't we can't, because of the laws that have been enacted, we can't take people to vote, but we can make sure that we can telephone people. And as women, we need to band together more and discuss issues that, like we're discussing today, in terms of voting and in terms of the importance of voting, particularly with the number of women. We hold the majority. And if you look in our churches and other organizations, women, as the pastor preached this morning about leaders, everyone is a leader. So everyone can be part of helping others, particularly women, to vote. And I hope I answered that in that non-about way.
Good evening.
Good
Dr.
evening.
Chavis, my Sarah. So good to see you. Good evening, everyone. I just have a comment about the ID voting. I just learned recently, I think when it first came out that we have to have an ID to vote, I was adamantly calling the Board of Elections because they didn't have the ability to give you an ID card, but now they do. And I found that out that last week, and I will be calling on a regular basis. And this ID vote, you can pick up a voter. They're free, and we need to. It will be mobile. So if you have the ability to contact the Board of Elections here and maybe set up, hey, come to my community, come over here. I'm working hard on trying to get them over there and over here you'd be surprised how many people don't have an ID card, like she said. And I was concerned about our elders who stopped driving. You may not have a new ID card. Well, I was told that you would be able to vote if your ID card is expired, but I would not count on that. And another comment I'd like to make is, I was 4 years old when this act passed, and everything was done in the church. Everything was done in the church. I would like to challenge our leaders, Christian, our pastors and leaders in that area. What happened with having this in the church again? Think about it. It's, we need to assemble in the church. And another comment I'll make and last, on tomorrow evening at 6 p.m., I'll be going to the Cumberland County Schools has started this, and I don't know the right name, I'll just put it in my own words, where the superintendent's coming out to the community, talking to, in different places, meeting with the public about schools. Well, civics class. I learned how to vote in civics class. I remember, was it Arthur Lane here who was running for something, and I didn't know who he was, but he offered me a full tank of gas to get his flyers out. But that's how I started. And then civics classes in school, we used to have marked voting. So what happened to some of those things? I'm not a teacher. I raised my kids to vote. So they, if they didn't get it in school, they were going to get it at home. So I'm just making a comment. What happened to that? Right now, the students need to be preparing to vote, just like we do, even if they're not of age to vote. So my question to Superintendent Connolly is going to be that, and how can we encourage high school? There are high schoolers that are of age to vote, and are we reaching those? So a great presentation, and I think the problem is we haven't kept this in the forefront. We've got a new civil right, what is it? This museum coming here. Okay, get to the table and make sure the stories are continue to be told. That's our perfect opportunity. I don't care if it says Civil War. That was our history. You got to get there and tell the story. Keep it going.
Okay.
First of all, Dr. Chavis, I want to thank you for what you have done this afternoon. This presentation you did was an eye-opener for us as a remembrance that made us go back and remember this. What I would hope is that when we do this again, that this room will be filled with more younger people that need to be reminded that their right to vote wasn't just on a whim. It was on the backs of other people who came up through the ranks to give them that right to vote. So hopefully we can do this again, and we will have more young people present when we do this. But again, I thank you.
I think we have a good turnout. This is the first time the Black History Ministry has had a face-to-face activity since when, Pastor? 2019. And we used to have afternoon programs, but we could not because of the pandemic. So this was kind of like a test to see where are we going from here, as Martin Luther King's book says.
Dr. Chavis, being a retired history teacher myself, there are several things that's going on now that people need to pay attention to.
Yes.
Like our state legislature, I think you talked about that earlier, how they're trying to gerrymander certain districts. If you don't understand what gerrymandering is, for instance, they might take a black district, predominantly black district, and take parts of it and move it somewhere else in another district, like for instance in a white district, where the number of white people outnumber the blacks. So they make sure that they get the voting advantage. If you don't understand what gerrymandering is. And North Carolina is guilty of that. If you don't know that. And I think I was looking at some other things as you were talking. The Edmund Pettus Bridge. I think most of the people remember, one time they tried to go across it and all the fighting started. But like you said, it was 3 times. And I think they also now are taking out of the curriculum certain things pertaining to African Americans. Black history classes. You probably won't see them shortly. The way things are going. They're trying to change that. So I would tell you to pay attention what's going on, especially in our legislature.
Thank you. And that is so true. And that's why I'm so thankful for our pastor, because he always encourages us to have Black history every day. Even though we were discussing the 3 marches and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, there's so much more to our history. But this is an essential and important piece of our history that we need to go back and read more about it to understand how we got to where we are today and what are some of the ways that were used back then that are now coming back and that will impact us tremendously. And so let's keep the conversation alive, not only the conversation, but our action. If we are to be a church of the community, a community, and if we are going to be citizens, then we have rights, and we must make sure that those rights are taken seriously and that we help others. There are a lot of people, young people, elderly people, that may not know and understand what we know. So every one of us are history people making. History people making. Every one of us can and we can do so much for others. That's one of the reasons why I'm so proud of our church, that we do have a lot of outreach and we do reach out in the community tremendously. And if there are no more comments and questions, I'd like for all members of the Black History Ministry to please stand and raise your hand. And we have some new members too that are Fred, stand up, you're a new member. The whole committee. Let's give all of the committee a hand. Louis. And Pastor, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Good evening, good afternoon, everyone. First of all, let's thank Dr. Chavis again for presenting I'm not quite sure if I'm the person that should come behind her to talk about what we've been talking about today. Oh, since I had the microphone, a part of what I think of our problem today is we're too blessed. Black people are blessed. Right over the city of Fayetteville, black people can live anywhere they want to live in the city of Fayetteville or anywhere. Live anywhere. Do whatever we have achieved. So I said that to say, when I say we're too blessed, in the blessing, we've lost focus. So you mentioned, Sister Leaks, why don't we do it in the church? Well, where ministry used to be focused on those civil rights and rights for people and people who are disenfranchised, we've become, and this is not necessarily a bad thing, we've become ministry oriented. Fighting for rights was ministry, but the focus in church has changed from a 1965 perspective. And in 1965, we were more community. 2023, you all drove in today from all over the city. We're not united like we used to be as far as having those collective community grassroots organizations. The grassroots organization in Fayetteville politics is so spread out. There is nothing that unifies. You got a group over here and a group over here and a group over there. And who then is the leader? So I don't want to get off on my soapbox about what I think is happening, but I will take the challenge. As a church and as a church in the community, we'll take the challenge of trying to do more to educate our people, which is why we changed the name Black History Committee to Black History Ministry, so that we can continually have these sessions for the community to study and learn. So another reason why we are where we are is we're not rehearsing and revisiting history like we did today. So in this voting season, now you feel more encouraged. You may feel more aware now to go pick up a book at your house and study. You may feel now more encouraged to pay attention to what you read in the newspaper. You may go back and even look up the state legislators and see what is really going on. So the history prompts you to be educated, which is why we have to do this more. So Black History Ministry, stay on top of education. Now, I'm very proud also to be a part of a group that meets Monday mornings at 6 a.m. And in this particular study, we are studying the 1619 Project. It's a group of men, and we meet every Monday at 6 a.m., and you'd be surprised, the brothers write in at 6 o'clock for an hour, and we're studying that history. So if you want a challenge today as you leave here, get you a group, pick up the 1619 Project or a Black History book, a group of you all, and study. That is another way to make sure we stay educated. And then others help others. And that's what prompts us to be better. Okay, we won't go any further, but once again, we want to thank all of you all to be here today. And again, take the challenge of reading. That's one thing. There's some books on Reconstruction. Go find those and read. What's on your Black History shelf at this very moment? And what are you reading at this very moment? I want you to read your Bible. Yes, read your Bible. And here's another challenge. Here's the challenge. Here, my last comment. Here's the challenge. Let's 30 minutes off of Facebook and read. How about that? Y'all looking at me strange, but that's okay. Okay, and then, all right, pick up. All right, notice those books out front. Take the challenge. Let's read, and we'll be promoting when our next event like this will be. All right, let's stand. And as we stand, Lily and Joseph, if you would come out here, please. Lily and Joseph, come on here. Would you all help us sing happy birthday to the leader of our media ministry? She was here this morning. She's back today. I don't know what she's done yet to celebrate her birthday today, but you all can be a part of the celebration by let's sing a happy birthday. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, Lillian. Happy birthday, Lil. Happy birthday. Father in heaven, we thank you for this time today. Let us be encouraged and inspired to be involved, to read, to study, to take the initiative to be involved in our community when we have community activities and events and meetings that are going on, that we would be there to make sure that representation is going forward. We love you. Bless you in Jesus' name. Amen. And thank you.